We come to the last panel of our 2-week session. This has been an exciting time, and I always say maybe it crescendos or ends with this exciting panel where we are going to discuss the world's economic challenges and the opportunities and challenges that we face. We're privileged today, like we were last year, to end our day with remarks with Ambassador Wolff. Ambassador Alan Wolff has been the Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization, and he served prior to that as U.S. States the Deputy Special Representative for Trade Negotiations in the Carter administration, was General Counsel of the Office in the Ford administration. He has a distinguished career in private practice. He was the acting head of the U.S. delegation for the Tokyo Round and the principal draftsman of the basic U.S. law creating a mandate for trade negotiations. Currently, he is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, where I understand is currently writing a book on the future of the trading system. So welcome. Joining us after Alan's remark, we all have James Bacchus, member of the Herbert A. Stifel Center for Trade and Policy Studies, a distinguished university professor of global affairs, and directors of the Center for Global Economic and Environmental Opportunity at the University of Central Florida. We're very privileged to have Jim here. Jim is the founding member and twice the chairman of the appellate body of the WTO that we have discussed at length during this session. He was instrumental to helping set up the foundations of the WTO appellate body system. Jim Bacchus is a former member of the U.S. Congress from Florida, former international trade negotiator for the United States, global fellow of CG in Canada, and adjunct scholar at Cato Institute. Please note that all of our speakers have their bios and their links on the Canvas website, so I'm not repeating all their accomplishments. Also on the panel is Daniel Crosby, partner and manager of the Geneva office at King & Spalding, where he specializes in international trade, investment, and matters related to public international law. He primarily helps sovereign and business clients achieve economic objectives by applying and negotiating international agreement. Much of Daniel's work centers on energy issues, from natural resources production to energy services and trade in petrochemicals. He has represented clients before the WTO dispute settlement mechanism. Antonio Nucifera is the practice manager, trade and regional integration at the World Bank. He was the World Bank's lead country economist for Brazil. Since joining the bank, he has worked on Central and Eastern European countries, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East and North Africa region. In his most recent assignment prior to Brazil, Antonio was based in Tunis, where he was a lead country economist for Tunisia. He arrived in Tunis 1 week before the 2011 revolution and led the bank's policy to the government of Tunisia during said revolution. Prior to that, he was the senior country economist for Malawi and Mozambique. Mary Lovely is a senior fellow at Peterson Institute and professor of economics, and Melvin A. Eggers faculty scholar at Syracuse University Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, where she combines interest in international economics and China's development. During 2011 to 2015, she served as the co-editor of China's Economic Review. Her current research projects investigate the effect of China's foreign direct investment policies on trade flows and entry mode, the relationship between proximity of export markets and cross-city wage variation, and the influence of Chinese tariffs reductions on labor shares of value in its manufacturing firms. Again, you can read more about her work and impressive work on the website, on Canvas. We have spoken a lot this week, and I hope you all are here because you realize that the world economic order is somewhat challenged. Pandemic is just a recent challenge, but some of it it predates it, and it all goes back to, as I said the first day, when things were set up in the post-World War II period with the setup of the Bretton Woods Institution. I can't imagine anyone better than Ambassador Wolff to kick us off on this and tell us about his views as to what he sees the future of the multilateral system and of the economic challenges that the world faces is. Thank you, Alan. I'll send it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Padideh. This has been a brilliant series of sessions, and I commend you and your colleagues for really putting on something that is of great value to all of us, not just students who are coming along and professionals, but those of us who've been in the field for a long time. The G7 recently met a couple of weeks ago and talked about their commitment to an open, resilient, rules-based order. That economic order to which they're referring is the product of, as you say, the wisdom and the foresight of planners during the World War II and just after. So we're 3/4 of a century into this system. And as you mentioned, it's part of multilateral institutions of the World Bank, the IMF, and for trade, it was originally going to be the ITO, but became the GATT. It's been astoundingly successful. I should say that I have written a written version of these remarks, and I'm just going to summarize, as Alexander Parola did in the last panel. It's been an astoundingly successful trade regime, multilateral trade system. As Victor do Prado in the initial sessions noted, it's added an information technology agreement, a pharmaceutical agreement for tariff-free trade, a trade facilitation agreement, a trade review mechanism, peer review by members of each other's policies. It has greatly increased transparency. It brought in 36 countries to join the original set, and 23 countries are in the anteroom waiting to get in. Yet there's a lot of disquiet about the WTO, a lot of challenges, a lot of unease about its durability. What is the problem? The series of problems. One is sovereign states. There are 164 members, each sovereign over their trade. So if you look at the WTO building, imposing as it is on the banks of Lake Geneva, you might think that there's a world trade governance that is independent somehow of its members. It is not so. It's a place to host negotiations, a place to enforce agreements only according to the will of its members. What are the multiple significant specific problems? First, the loss of binding dispute settlement, which has been referred to repeatedly in the panel, so I won't go into all the reasons for that. But the US blocking appointments to the appellate body, not all judgments of panels are now final. And since the hallmark of the WTO was binding dispute settlement of enforceability of agreements, that's very damaging. Second, the inability to update the system, also been referred to by many in these panels. What has it failed to do? It has really not updated the system to deal with the pandemic. There's a lot that's gone right with respect to the pandemic and trade. Trade has been essential to move essential medical goods across borders, now to move vaccines across borders. But in fact, the organization hasn't revised its rules to deal with this and future pandemics. Dealing with the digital economy, which again, the last panel referred to. The question is, are the rules going to be fragmented on a regional basis, on a national basis, or will there be some coherency on a multilateral basis? The WTO cannot fail to put into place rules to safeguard the environment. It can't dodge the issue. There will be carbon border adjustment measures taken, and they're going to be quite stiff, quite serious, and it can either be done cooperatively or there'll be conflicts. Humanitarian issues, the flow of food across borders from areas of plenty to areas of shortage in a time of climate change. What has to change? A number of panelists have talked about the need to get past consensus, meaning unanimity, to the ability to have more flexibility. And secondly, there has to be a stronger desire among the key members to obtain results. Plurilaterals are way forward. There needs to be a win on the board in terms of negotiations, and fishery subsidies is, by happenstance, the most ripe agreement to reach a conclusion, and it has to go forward to demonstrate some confidence in the system. Third, differences over fundamental principles and shared values. The Saudi presidency of the G20 exposed not only where there's areas of agreement on what the principles are of the WTO, the shared values, but also areas of difference on market-oriented policies, on special and differential treatment. Market-oriented principles, obviously, there's strong disagreement between China on the one hand and Western trading nations on the other as to whether that's central to the WTO. And it's in the Marrakesh agreement. The place of development in the system, a division over whether there should be blanket special and differential treatment. I'd say number 4, absence of an executive. Every organization one can think of any size, corporations, governments, NGOs, have some form of executive within the organization. That is not really the case with respect to the WTO. The Director General cannot initiate proposals. The Director General cannot settle disputes. The Director General, the Secretariat, cannot, without the permission of members, report on what countries, its members, are doing with respect to trade. Number 5, the necessity for leadership. The United States was essential to the founding of the organization, it moving forward. The EU was its partner in setting up the WTO, along with a Quad, Japan and Canada. At present, one can't really have a multilateral agreement without all the major countries, including China and India, the mid-sized countries as well, involved and on board. Number 6, the place for plurilateral agreements, the subject of your last panel. The Trade and Services Agreement was taking place outside the walls of the WTO. Didn't go forward, but the major issue is, can plurilaterals have a home within the WTO? Lastly, number 7, the impact of the geopolitical rivalry, the rivalry between China and the United States. Is the WTO relevant? It can be with respect to finding areas of cooperation. If the two can reach agreement on anything, that can, if there are matters of general applicability, can be brought into the system. And sometimes it may be better to have more participants in the room. So one could deal with issues that are largely between China and the United States, and might facilitate things to have others involved. But the strategic competition is going to overshadow much of what's going on in the WTO on industrial subsidies, on agriculture domestic support, even on fishery subsidies, on carbon border adjustment mechanisms, and even on reconstituting binding dispute settlement. So it's best for those interested in improving the system, I believe, to push ahead on all fronts, seek to move ahead on the issues I've just raised. The WTO is not going to solve the geopolitical rivalry. It will reflect it, but there can be progress made. My conclusion on the future of the world trading system: world trade takes place to serve people. It's existed for millennia because people need or desire goods and services sourced from outside their local boundaries. The founders were motivated by creating a system that promotes economic well-being as a condition for achieving and maintaining peace. Businesses require certainty. Workers equally require a rules-based global system that's inclusive in its benefits for women, for small business, for farmers, for industrial workers, for goods and services, for traditional commerce, and for digital commerce. Boris Johnson and Joe Biden issued a new Atlantic Charter that talked about working through a rules-based international order to tackle global challenges together. The G7 summit in Cornwall on June 11 to 13 provided a detailed pledge, a sort of roadmap on issues that those who are present want to address. That there is a global economic order at all is because there were dedicated individuals who decided 3/4 of a century ago that they would accomplish what had never been done before, what had never been achieved, a global system. It was hard won, it's of great value, it must be treasured, but to sustain the order, it must be improved, and the time to start is now. The school and its participants in these sessions have a role to play. It's time to craft a WTO 2.0. All those who wish to do so can actually contribute, make the world a better place, and it's exciting and rewarding to try to make a difference. I look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you, Alan. You've covered a lot of areas that I think were raised in this 2 weeks as well by others, and put them all together so it works well. I am going to turn now to Jim Bacchus for his views as to what are the challenges that the multilateral system faces and the world economic challenges that you have mentioned as well. Yes, Jim.
Thank you so much, Padideh, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this outstanding event. I regret that I wasn't able to accept your invitation to speak on trade and environment 2 days ago because I had a conflict, but keep me in mind for next year. I owe you one. And I appreciate this opportunity to be here, especially with my longtime friend, Alan Wolff. Alan and I have worked in the same vineyards on trade for more than 4 decades now, and we share the same goals. Indeed, I think it appropriate that I express publicly my appreciation to him for the fact that in 1979, when I was first going to work at USTR and had just for the first time read the GATT, he took the time to begin to educate me on the trading system. So Alan shares in the blame for anything I may have done where I've gone awry. Let me say also that I agree with 100% of what he's just said. So I won't go into any of those other issues, but I encourage all of you to read his remarks in their fullness, which he did not have time to say in full today. And in the spirit of exchange, I want to point out where he and I may have a difference. Indeed, I've long had one in looking at the trading system. But before doing that, let me say that I do not think the appellate body is perfect. I think the appellate body comes closer to perfection than the Supreme Court of the United States. I think that especially after the ruling yesterday in the voting rights case. But I do think the appellate body has done a good job of fulfilling its mandate from the members under the dispute settlement understanding that's part of the WTO agreement. This does not mean I agree with everything the appellate body has said and done since I left the appellate body 18 years ago, nor does it necessarily mean that I agree with every single word of every opinion that I sign. There's a consensus involved in reaching a decision on appeal in the appellate body. And for example, for the record, I do not agree with how the appellate body has defined the phrase public body in the WTO agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. Also, I have to say that the appellate body has become a bit wordy in recent years and has sometimes strayed into some loose language and should roll that back. But while the appellate body is not perfect, it's also not guilty of most of the sins of which it is accused, and which most within the Beltway are now simply taken as givens in any discussion about the dispute settlement system. There's been too little pushback by anyone in the United States against this notion that the appellate body has vastly exceeded its mandate by overreaching and reaching its judgments. This is simply not true. And its extremes, this is one more big lie at an age in which, alas, the United States is awash in big lies. I also would say that it's imperative that the WTO negotiate better disciplines on subsidies and improve rules on other aspects of trade remedies. In some ways, the rules are insufficient. And if it's the case that the members think the appellate body has gone astray, it's very simple for them to correct that if they choose to do so. But I'll note that to date, it's mostly, and indeed in many respects entirely, and only the United States that feels this way. And let me point to one thing that Alan wrote in his paper, and of course, I'm happy for him to respond in the spirit of mutual exchange of views, with which I fundamentally disagree, and he won't be surprised by this. Alan has said, with respect to what he rightly calls the loss of a binding dispute settlement, that this is due to a, and here I quote, steady erosion of remedies available against injurious trade. And then he goes on to say in his paper that the narrowing of the effectiveness of trade remedies through quasi-judicial interpretations of the WTO rules has created an imbalance in the WTO agreements. Now, I just don't agree with that. You know, Alan and I probably disagreed on this for at least 30 years. I maintain instead that the loss of binding dispute settlement is due mainly to a steady erosion of the willingness of the United States to comply fully with WTO rules on trade remedies when there are allegations of injurious trade. So I come at this from an entirely different viewpoint. Now, as I see it, this is especially the case with U.S. anti-dumping measures, which have gone wild under both, well, under Democratic and Republican administrations alike over the past 15 to 20 years. There's abundance of documentation of that. Moreover, I think it is part of a broader retreat by the United States from upholding the rule of law in international trade. And this, of course, concerns me as someone who has devoted my life to the international rule of law and trade. And I want to hasten to say that Alan has done the same. In many places within the Beltway, the logic of what I see as a false syllogism prevails. First, active United States engagement is essential to the success of the WTO. Second, to sustain domestic political support for U.S. engagement in the WTO, the United States must be given very broad latitude to apply trade remedies. Therefore, third, other members of the WTO must give the United States this very broad latitude on trade remedies. That's the logic. Now, I fear what will happen if the other members of the WTO accede to the continuing U.S. demands to follow this logic. Thus far, I see no difference in the approach of the Biden administration to that of the Trump administration on this critical and central issue. I would suggest to the Biden administration another syllogism. First, the United States needs the international rule of law in trade in order to maximize its prosperity and help secure the safety of the world. Second, binding WTO dispute settlement upholds the international rule of law in trade, which I think has been proven over the past quarter of a century in WTO dispute settlement. Therefore, the United States must support binding WTO dispute settlement. And this, I think, means the early restoration of the appellate body and an early agreement by the United States that this has to happen. I am concerned that even the European Union, which has been a strong supporter of reconstituting the appellate body as soon as possible, seems to be saying now that, well, let's see if we can agree in November at the 12th Ministerial Conference that it will reconstitute the appellate body by the time of the 13th Ministerial Conference. That's several years. Appeals are pending and other appeals can't be taken. And in effect, we're back in the GATT. And as Alan said, we have lost binding dispute settlement. Lastly, I want to say that I'm concerned about what will happen at this turning point for the WTO. Increasingly, other members of the WTO are desperate to get the U.S. once again fully engaged in an affirmative way in the multilateral trading system. The Biden administration seems to be much more inclined toward that than the Trump administration, but let's just say that's a pretty low bar, since the Trump administration did everything it possibly could to undermine the WTO and the international rule of law. But I'm concerned that the other members of the WTO may yield to the temptation in their urgent need to re-engage the United States to appease the United States by capitulating on fundamental principles about the independence and impartiality of jurists in the WTO dispute settlement system, which I see as absolutely indispensable to the success of the system and of the WTO itself. And this, of course, includes crucially that of a reconstituted appellate body. Padideh, I think I've taken enough time. Again, let me underscore that I agree 100% with everything Alan has said. And I urge you to read the fullness of his paper where he's elaborated on a whole lot of other things with which I fully agree. But this is an issue that I think ought to be underscored in this conference because it's central, I think, to everything else that all in the conference have been discussing. Thanks so much, and thanks again to Alan for putting up with this critique.
Jim, I will go back to Alan as well to talk about the rule-based.
Yes, please. He needs a chance to respond.
The dispute settlement system, but I want to allow Daniel and Mary and Antonio to make their initial remarks first, and then we'll come back because that has been the appellate body and actually a dispute settlement system. Binding dispute settlement system has been a theme, of course, throughout. And one thing that occurred to me and to everybody else is that with the rise of issues such as climate change, labor, gender, all of these new ideas. At the same, I mean, they're becoming more, obviously the USMCA included some of these things in a way that's not in the WTO, but at a time when all of this is happening, we are also losing a sort of a binding dispute settlement system. Some would say that you can get more agreements. Some have blamed the dispute settlement system for lack of agreement because it's sort of countries worry that they're going to be bound. So maybe there's going to be, I get the
political
sense
temptation is
there's a
always
political
to put
temptation
decisions
to
to the judges.
yeah, that you
You're
can
right.
move things better without a binding dispute settlement on the diplomatic side. I'm going to turn to Daniel Crosby right now. Daniel, your response and your comments about the challenges we all face and the opportunities.
Thanks, Padideh. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor to return to the Washington College of Law, where I studied and got my degree. So I miss Alan. He's left Geneva and is back in Washington, and now I'm back in Geneva after spending the COVID year in Washington. It's good to be back since yesterday, and we're getting back up and running here, which is a good reason to talk about the future of the WTO and its challenges. And I think I'd like to focus on Alan's observation that the WTO is about convergence and not coexistence. And I think the reason I'd like to focus on that, especially for the students, is because I think the resolution of that issue will determine the architecture of the WTO going forward and will provide challenging jobs for many of the students and articles that need to be written and history that needs to be reminded to everyone. So to Alan's observation about convergence, that's what the WTO is about, not coexistence, I would add my observation that the GATT and the WTO are not and were never intended to have universal membership, and only countries that agree to follow the rules of the contract are intended to enjoy non-discriminatory treatment in trade relations and access to each other's markets. And I think that's a kind of fundamental that sometimes we gloss over in looking at all the numbers of countries that have joined and all this great kind of movement towards universality. But as a general point on all commercial and economic relations, unless the contracting parties agree to certain fundamental principles that guide their interactions, the agreements they reach can't really function very well and sometimes create more tension than they resolve. So parties don't implement their own obligations if they think other parties that they've contracted with are not operating under the same basic set of principles. So further to those couple of observations, I'll make a few points. One of them Alan mentioned at last year's G20, there were very explicit conclusions that confirmed that members have not converged on the most basic foundational WTO principles. Alan also mentioned that the question of whether market-oriented policies are an underlying assumption of the WTO should be beyond debate. However, the minutes of the WTO General Council meetings over the last year record a very intense debate exactly on that point. So there are questions that should be beyond debate, but are being are the subject of heated debates all the time. But it gets worse, in my view, because even where members assert a sort of convergence on WTO principles like they did in the G20, for example, with respect to the centrality of the rule of law, transparency, and non-discrimination, we all know that even those points are not really shared. Lots of countries have very different ideas of what the rule of law is. China claims that it has the rule of law, and that law is the law of the state and the Communist Party, and that's a very different kind of rule of law than a lot of other countries have in mind, for example. So I question whether there's convergence on many of the issues on the long list of fundamentals. So countries need to consider the effect on their rights and the benefits under the WTO trade contract, where the fundamental WTO rule of law, both domestically and internationally, does not ensure that free market forces determine competitive outcomes, as Alan suggested they should. As I said earlier, only countries that agree to follow the basic rules are intended to enjoy non-discriminatory treatment in trade relations. And this brings us to the practicality of what's going on in Geneva and in capitals. So for example, the United States in the last years determined that China is not implementing its obligations to allow the market to determine trade outcomes. So it basically ended market-based most favored nation trade with China by negotiating a phase one agreement that manages bilateral trade between those countries. And of course, this is a direct violation of the WTO's foundational MFN principle, because the US-China agreement provides advantages bilaterally that are not accorded to all WTO members unconditionally. So the status quo is, from my perspective, that the world's two largest traders have agreed to dispense with WTO rules in a very significant way, and most other members are really just watching. So here's the good news. Your work as students and professionals is needed to settle this fundamental issue. How should WTO members confirm which principles they actually converge on? And what should they do in cases where non-market systems are proposed to coexist with market-oriented economic systems? And what are the effects on the balance of rights and obligations? Finally, in what areas can members reach multilateral outcomes while disagreeing on foundational principles? What is the positive agenda for the WTO? Where can we move given the kind of facts of where we stand and what the G20 and G7 and others have concluded as a political and economic reality? So I would conclude by saying, if the phase one agreement provides any indication of the future, countries will look for pragmatic solutions. As we see with the phase one agreement, that doesn't always mean multilateral solutions and compliance with WTO rules, but hopefully you all can find a way to bring the solutions back to the multilateral system where they belong. But that will require really looking at the reality of the situation and not just saying we want and believe in rules-based trade when we know that's not what's happening in reality in all these areas. Before I end, I'd like to kind of avoid a back and forth and have a brief comment on Jim Bacchus's statement about trade remedies that we all see from here, and kind of note that I think years ago, I think the United States was ahead of kind of even within the Beltway, this kind of rhetoric that he's mentioning about the WTO overstepping. But I think now there actually has been a pretty clear consensus that there has been a problem in the appellate body. Not that we need to block it or ruin it or destroy it, but the problem is recognized. The United States reaction to the problem was not welcomed by most members, but the problem, I would say, even for those of us who are big fans of the WTO and the appellate body, the problem is clearly there, especially on trade remedies, and not only anti-dumping and subsidies, but safeguards. You know, since the first decisions that the appellate body made, they basically ruled out any use of the safeguards agreement that members put in place to try to have a political.
Yeah, that's not remotely true.
Anyway,
the problem in those cases is the United States had refused to comply with the safeguards agreement.
Yeah,
if
so
the country wants to comply with the rules, they
everyone
impose a safeguard.
Everyone
I
can
take your position, and I know where you're coming from.
Yeah.
But
So
there's anything but a consensus that the appellate body has done the kinds of overreaching that it's accused of doing. Again,
so
I don't think it's perfect, but I understand your point of view and where you're coming from.
I
Yeah.
appreciate you understand my point of view, but I've been sitting here for 20 years watching it happen. And I'm telling you, when I talk to all the ambassadors and people within the WTO, they're very frustrated at the appellate body and what's happened I would suggest
that if the appellate body had taken the opposite position on a number of these trade remedies rules, then you would have virtually every other member of the WTO up in arms, while the U.S. was less smiling. So, you know, the appellate body is in a no-win position. What it has to do is do its best job in upholding the rules in which the members have agreed.
Anyway, now a
Thank you.
whole bunch to come up with solutions to address the problems that they all agree exist, even though you don't. And I think they will address those concerns.
I think there's some problems. I think fundamentally one of the problems is one that no one ever mentions, which is somehow the members of the WTO have decided that the members of the appellate body don't have to be lawyers. And that's a huge problem, I can tell you, being someone who served within the appellate body. And that leads to loose language. It leads to not understanding basic legal concepts like how far do we have to go to rule on this issue and when should we stop? And those are the kinds of issues that I think need to be addressed and need to be in mind when we appoint new members of the appellate body. But on other things, zeroing and the like, I'm sorry. All this is blown way out of proportion. And I believe the appellate body has done the right things in the vast number of those cases. Again, people who have a certain perspective based on what they do every day and where they're coming from in terms of their own practice. I understand that. I was in the private practice of law for many, many years, and people have a certain point of view, but that's just a vast, vast overstatement to say that there's a consensus on this issue.
It's exciting for our students to see, for our participants to see the disagreements that are there on this issue. Daniel, I don't want to. I want you. Are you finished with your remarks?
No, I'm finished, and I didn't want to distract with that.
No, that is good. I'm actually, because we ended up on the topic of countries that don't agree with what even the concept of rule of law is or with each other. I would like to turn to Mary Lovely, given her sort of also her experience and extensive experience in China, to give us her take on any aspect of what has been discussed and your own views also about what you see as what are the major challenges that we face and opportunities in the world of economic relations. Mary.
Well, thank you, Padideh. Like other participants, I'm very grateful for the invitation and having this time to speak with the participants. I guess this means that, Antonio, you're playing cleanup batter, so I think that's probably good because I hope to end my remarks a little bit on how the developing world sees this, and I hope you'll give some remarks on the wider picture beyond US-China. I think the discussion we just had between Daniel and James was very interesting. I love to see it. I think that the pandemic perhaps has had one good effect. I know it's very hard to find anything good in this, but I think it's helped more governments and citizens see that the world is changing extremely rapidly and that the economic order can be upended much more easily than many of us ever thought possible. And that we need new thinking, and we need it sooner rather than later. I'm sure there are many people in my generation who would have been very happy to go to their grave without ever really tackling climate change, global pandemics, etc. And I hope that this has been a wake-up call that all generations need to participate in solutions. We're here today to discuss challenges facing the global trading system. And what is clear is that the participants in this program are going to be called upon during their careers to help find solutions that have eluded us for quite some time. I'm joining some of the world's most talented trade lawyers today, so I won't have the audacity to comment on how best to fix the system. Instead, since I'm a student of China's development and US-China's trade relations, I'm going to try to take just a few minutes to try to suggest how these institutional conflicts fit into the larger challenges that we see in the global economic order. I think we've seen on this panel that two very distinguished observers can look at the same problems and see something very different. What is the conflict that's driving this? Well, last month in Cornwall, the US and the rest of the G7 countries reiterated their commitments to a rules-based multilateral trading system. Indeed, by some counts, rules-based was the most commonly uttered phrase in the Biden administration pressers following the G7 meetings. Rules-based has such a nice sounding agreement. When you're a parent, you try to apply rules that apply equally. Just in parenting, we see that actually it's not that easy to create rules that are fit for not only every situation, but also a situation that is dynamic, like a changing global economy would be. So what are the key problems? Well, I think one is, and we've already heard some discussion, how do we decide on what the rules are? We thought we had a basis. It was sort of neoclassical economics. We understand what market prices are. But even there, I think that we have had more obfuscation of conflicts for a longer period of time than we've been willing to admit. There is disagreement on what market-oriented means. Daniel discussed at length the recent questioning at the WTO on fundamentals such as market-oriented economies. He clearly identified the exit of the United States from the system with regard to its trade with China. And I'll come back to US-China relations in a minute. But we have to recognize that even the United States and the European Union cannot always agree on how to decide what a market price is. Witness the longstanding disagreements over subsidies in Airbus Boeing case, which I think all of us hope we never have to deal with again. But these subsidy issues are going to come back full force for, I think, at least two reasons. One, citizens are demanding some answers to questions, particularly in the United States, on inequality. Governments have to answer one way or another. The Biden administration has a very vigorous, robust program of government intervention into the economy, spending not only for infrastructure, which most would say are not actionable subsidies in any way, but also on things like billions of dollars for new semiconductor factories and batteries and EVs. So we're going to see increased use of subsidies in the West. How does that going to play into market-based prices? The second is that subsidies are absolutely going to be needed to help move the transition from a fossil fuel-based economy to a renewables-based economy. And how is the WTO going to create rules that allow that, plus trade in those products? Now, economic theory has long taught us that almost all subsidies affect supply and demand and thus can affect trade flows. I think we in the trade community have somehow found a comfortable corner to say, well, okay, but you can't have export subsidies and you can't have these particular subsidies, when in fact, that's a little bit of covering up what could be massive disagreements. Those were hidden after China joined the WTO with this belief that China was eventually going to move away from government intervention in the economy. That has not been proven true. And so we wake up to find that our convenient fallacy or self-delusion just isn't going to do it anymore. So how do we create new rules when subsidies are coming? And we could also make similar discussion about facing national security challenges, which I'll leave for another day. The second question is, how do we resolve conflicts around rules that we create? And Daniel identified the fact that the U.S.-China, in a sense, had a divorce and had a split and a settlement. And I think that almost everybody, or I would say everybody on this panel, will agree that the settlement is clearly suboptimal. It is managed trade. The tariffs that Trump chose to levy never made sense on an economic perspective for the United States, never mind the global economy. He just sort of threw the card table over and said, deal with it. So we are stuck with what is clearly a suboptimal situation. So even if we say, well, US-China is never going to agree, they have this, it was created in the most haphazard way possible. We all lived through it. It was exciting to wake up and look at your tweets and find out what the heck happened last night. But I, for one, am glad it's over and hopefully can find a way to change it. So can we find a mechanism for US-China decoupling that is consistent in some way with WTO rules, either the rules that exist or the rules that will exist? I think this is going to come very clearly to a head with semiconductors. It's clear that the US and China will eventually have two separate supply chains for semiconductors for their own use. But what about the semiconductors that are embedded in products that are produced throughout Asia? If you look at the trade flows and dig deeper, you'll see how deeply, deeply integrated these economies are in electronics, one of the most highly traded outside of natural resources products in the world. And how do we actually begin to look ahead and see this train is heading down that track? So that's a big warning. Can the WTO play a useful role in what I call midwifing this split? Lastly, how do we create a living system for rules making? We've seen that rules making new rules has been very, very difficult at the WTO, notwithstanding the progress that has been made, as Ambassador Wolff outlined. I think we're facing new challenges as we enter a period where of real action on climate change. We have to begin to tackle the hard things. And in particular, I might just put in a note for tackling services trade, something that is very understudied. We don't even have the transparency on the flows that happen to actually study it appropriately. Unless we get, I think, more attention on services trade, it's going to be very hard to convince citizens in the advanced countries that the WTO works for them. We have almost an unremitting stream of negativity on trade coming out of politicians. You know, last year for this course, you know, I was focused on the world's young people who have been really harmed by the pandemic. Having, you know, being a college professor myself and watching what's happened to this young generation, how do we help them to see the relevance of the WTO and the benefits of trade? It's not that they are, unconcerned about the world. They are very concerned about climate change, racial inequality, even global poverty. But do they see trade as part of the answer? I would argue that largely we are losing that war. We are not talking about the benefits of trade, the benefits for development of trade. We see, as Simon Evenet at Global Trade Alert in his last report pointed out, increasing barriers to foreign direct investment, something that many developing countries need badly. How do we turn this around? I'm afraid that all the emphasis on trade enforcement, something that USTR Catherine Tai repeats constantly, maybe music to lawyers' ears for a variety of reasons. Law is good, enforcing the law is good, you know, more billable hours are good, but is this really the only message that we want to send? Why make new laws that can't be enforced? Why make new laws that seem to undermine labor standards, that seem to undermine the environment?
You got mute. You got muted, Mary.
Sorry. So I'll just end with say, how do we change the narrative to look at the ways that trade and global cooperation, which is really what the WTO represents? It is, I think, one of the finest examples we have of how global cooperation can make the world a better place. How do we, convince our younger people that this is something that is worth fighting for?
That's very good. Thank you so much, Mary. I'm going to now turn to Antonio. We've talked about the trading system. We've talked about China relations. I want to talk from your perch at the World Bank. Tell us how you see things playing out and, of course, the role of trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Padideh. And indeed, it's a privilege to be with such distinguished panelists. And I will start with that disclaimer that I'm probably the only not lawyer on the panel. I'm a development economist, and I'll contribute indeed a little bit, a couple of points from the developing countries perspective.
I think Mary's an economist.
Yes,
We
I
tried.
am not a lawyer.
Okay, fantastic.
Unfortunately,
then,
I guess.
Then I'll focus on the development part of it. And let me also, I thank you, Jim. Let me also add, I think there is a consensus amongst the panelists, starting from the remarks of Ambassador Wolff, that we need to make sure that the WTO, that we get the WTO back and fully working. If not, there are less trade rules to protect weaker economies, and there is nowhere to take the new and pressing issues. That said, I think that what we also need to put on the table is that the trade and development debate needs really a focus which is dual. That we need to have to look at development, yes, as a means to help poor economies, to help development, to help them at a macro level in growth, but also as a tool to facilitate the economic opportunities reach the poorest inside every country, developed countries and developing countries alike. And trade, we know from research, can help overcome structural impediments that hinder women's economic participation. We know that trade is part of the solution to climate change if prices of carbon were correct, by enabling products to be produced in the most efficient, also from a carbon perspective, manner. So the development perspective is critical both at the macro level, but also when we start to looking at the quality of trade, whether it's inclusion, whether it's climate. Now, in this sense, I also fully agree with Ambassador Wolff's remarks. The supporting trade and the rule-based system that underpins trade means supporting economic development and poverty reduction, and thereby also securing future global prosperity and stability, something that he also elaborated on quite significantly in his written remarks. However, I want to add a couple of points from the developing countries' perspective. In what we have seen as the COVID crisis has hit the world, and as Mary was just saying, is the protectionist rhetoric and measures have been on the rise, fueling further economic nationalism. Now, in a way, this is not a new phenomenon. Of course, trade liberalization rarely enjoyed popular support. And this is because when a tariff is lifted, many producers and consumers benefits, but it might put the livelihoods of some industries, some businesses or employers at risk. And understandably, their opposition is loud. However, this has also been exacerbated now with the experience, in a way, with the, let me say, with the pressures that have been experienced as a result of the COVID pandemic, because we have seen the trade rules have been undermined. Mari was making reference just now to the latest global trade alerts. And this is, in many ways, changing the perspective in which many developing countries are also viewing trade as a possible locomotive for development, as a possible path to development. So it is important to underscore that if we want to build consensus for open markets, if we want to, to ensure that there is this belief and commitment to changing and strengthening the WTO, we must make sure the trade flows freely in good times and in bad times. And this is critical at the moment. Again, we just look at what's happening. If I think of, how South Africa, for instance, at the moment must be viewing the global discussion on vaccines, on access to medical goods. I think this is a real concern that could undermine the belief in the system and ultimately undermine also the ability to have an effective trade body in the WTO. Developing countries, especially least developed countries, we know are highly import development in critical medical products that are needed to contain the spread of the virus. They're critically dependent on agricultural commodities that are needed to achieve food securities. And of course, as I was just mentioning, the vaccines are only produced in a handful of the mostly advanced countries, leaving aside China and India as the main exceptions. So ensuring unrestricted access of these essential goods or vaccines is critical. And frankly, what we have seen in recent months does a lot of damage in terms of the belief in the system, in terms of the ability to rebuild a WTO that is stronger and more effective. It also weakens the leadership of those countries that impose these uncooperative policies. But ultimately, what's probably more important is this, undermining the ability to build consensus on reforming multilateral trade rules. I would also add, to conclude, that I see reasons to be optimistic because despite some, let me call it, bad behaviors, which in some ways are also understandable, the crisis has made it clear that we need more cooperation to grow together. And it's also made it clear that we are an interconnected world, and it would be globally unsustainable not to rebuild in a much more inclusive manner. And as we look ahead, I see, and I'll conclude with this, I see three sort of single issues that are in a way stepping stones. The most pressing, as I mentioned, is access to vaccines, enough to reach the poor and vulnerable and to end the global pandemic, since indeed we are all interdependent on this. And I would broaden this to say access to and free flow of essential goods, both medical and food. Secondly, there is the climate perspective. I haven't spoken much about it, but essentially, as I mentioned, trade is a key part of the solution to the climate crisis, and this has not really been, in a way, underscored enough. And therefore, the WTO has a key role to play on trade and climate change, on solving the climate change challenge. And this will also enhance its relevance, as this is really the biggest challenge facing us all when we look medium to long term. And in that context, we have, of course, a WTO ministerial coming later this year, which is another occasion to focus on these countries, the sort of inclusiveness at global level, but also at within countries of trade and the benefits of trade, the climate change debate and the role of trade in this, and charting forward an inclusive post-COVID agenda at the ministerial to restore trade as the engine of global growth and poverty reduction, but a trade which, as I said, is a higher quality trade, so greener, more inclusive, and also more resilient. Let me stop it here and allow others to react. And also we want to go back to the discussion on the rule-based system, but certainly happy to elaborate later on my views on the challenges and opportunities in terms of where we are on the global situation and the role that trade can play in boosting the recovery. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I'm going to turn back to Ambassador Wolff to see if there are any comments he would like to make in regard to comments that were made, and then we can follow up on there. Alan.
Thank you very much, Padideh. I really enjoyed the comments from the others and learned from them. Jim Bacchus is right with respect to, there is a split in terms of how one looks at the appellate body. 4 years ago, sitting in my office in Geneva, a foreign minister came to visit and he said, I like the rulings of the appellate body. He was talking about presumably things like zeroing, trade remedies. And I said, that's fine. You can put them in a scrapbook and look at them from time to time. You won't have an appellate body. And that's what happened. I would not have done what the Trump administration did. I think none of us would have, but they did. They got to like it the way it is, I think. The absence of binding dispute settlement. It was suspected that's what they were after for all along. I'm not sure that was the case, but once it happened, they could live with that very happily. And now it's climbing back is very difficult. Jim has said the members could make changes if they were unhappy. The members actually are unable to make changes, unfortunately, on many issues. So I think that the new appellate system or the new dispute settlement system, whatever emerges, is going to be a little bit different to try to make changes that won't rely on the members being able to legislate because they prove themselves unable to do so. because there is a lack of consensus in a fundamental way. What Jim mentioned, not today, but previously, is morality in the system, which I think is a very important point. Morality with respect to climate, morality with respect to women's participation, morality with respect to the pandemic, obviously. There is a moral element that's always been there, or at least since the special pharmaceutical element was put into TRIPS years ago. There's morality with respect to the movement of food across borders. There's morality with respect to moral element with respect to the World Food Program being exempt from export restrictions, which couldn't be agreed, including being blocked by a country that is a major beneficiary of the World Food Program. So there has to be change, and the direction is clear. It's going to be better, if the U.S. says, for workers. No one's disagreeing with that. It's going to be better for those who rely on food that subject to climate events. With respect to Daniel's very interesting statements on the price of belonging and universality, I wasn't a pro-universality person when I joined the WTO. Then I became a pro-universe. The accessions division reported to me, and universality seemed like a pretty good idea. I'd caution some degree of patience. One could have thrown Japan out in the 1970s, out of the GATT, and said they're just not playing by the rules. They evolved. That solved the problem. Brazil could have been thrown out at a certain point. They've changed their trade policies dramatically, and are great supporters of the system now. What happens is there are extra mural responses, which we don't like, but they may be as necessary. I don't like the phase one agreement. I agree with others on that point, but some things are done outside. That was true with US-Japan. It's true with respect to the US and the EU on steel and aluminum, acting in what most probably would say is in breach of their obligations. I'm not a believer in burning down the current edifice to see whether we could rebuild something entirely new. First, we try to save this one and improve it. Mary has pointed out a number of very interesting issues on, for example, subsidies and the need to have some real deliberation in Geneva on them. I received at Buenos Aires a number of countries have put together a declaration on fossil fuel subsidies, disciplines on fossil fuel subsidies. There isn't enough transparency. That's a start. There has to be full transparency, and there has to be deliberation, engagement. I haven't given up on the young, by the way. Polls in the United States still show that the young like free trade, and white males over age 55 don't like free trade agreements. There is an answer for
Where does that leave us?
It leaves us headed for the final end of our involvement in all of this. And we see the young, I've said, you know, what happens when we die and the young age and they change their point of view? And I say, we who have died would be very disappointed. Lastly, on development, very good points raised by Antonio and Mary. I chaired the Cotton Development Assistance Forum in the WTO. There was no political rhetoric in it. It's really an exciting part of the WTO to be part of. 4 very, very poor countries, Benin, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Mali, come in and they say what they need. They need to get more value out of byproducts from cotton, for example. They're very practical. And everyone is responsive. India, Pakistan, Brazil, the United States, the EU, Uzbekistan, others, they all say, okay, how can we can give you technical assistance, how can we help you? There are a lot of good things that go on within the WTO, but the lesson for me, and I'll end on this, the lesson for me with respect to development assistance is to get it away from the political rhetoric and into like the trade facilitation agreement. How can we make things better for the least developed? And that's essential. They have to be, one could say, well, they're not part of the system. They really can't contribute. They can contribute by moving away from political statements and into submissions on exactly what they need. And I think they'll get a decent response from the developed world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. I wanted to sort of, maybe we can just end talking about the appellate body mechanism and what you think is a likely short-term outcome. I mean, it's true, there's a lot of criticism of, as somebody who taught international law, we loved the appellate body. Maybe that was because we were too much in the practice in academic world, but it created, I think it contributed a lot to development of public international law, its use of public international law. And it was inevitable, some of the, I think, the backlash that was felt. But it's also not unusual for the United States to be opposed to international courts. It's not, I mean, I don't want to say it's all the same, but we have it with the International Criminal Court, we have it with the ICJ. So there is this strain of exceptionalism that comes from us in that regard, in terms of wanting to be bound by international law. So if there are any crystal balls, I do think that I think everybody's getting comfortable with not having an appellate body in some ways, more comfortable than I thought they would be, not just the United States. So I'm just curious as to what you think should be maybe a solution, maybe any ideas as where we should go from there. Maybe Jim, you want to start and then go to Alan.
Yes, I will. Thank you. Yeah. Let me first of all say I agree with everything Alan just said. And I thought the presentations by both Mary and Antonio were outstanding. And apart from our disagreement on the appellate body, I think Daniel made some excellent points, especially as relates to the reality of what's happening in terms of what I see as an increasing retreat from binding dispute settlement worldwide. The challenge is in turning away from the direction we're going and turning back to where we have been trying to get for some time. I was in the Congress at the time, as the students won't know, but others of you do, and one of the original co-sponsors in the House of the Uruguay Round Trade Agreements. I can recall sitting in a session in the Ways and Means Committee. Two of the staffers there were Bruce Wilson and Rufus Yerxa. Bruce later became legal advisor to the WTO, and Bruce was, of course, Deputy Director General, but at the time they were at USTR, and I was working with them. And in this session with several other members of Congress, Bruce made it a point to say, by the way, it's important for the members to realize that in accepting a binding dispute settlement system, we also will be bound by it. And there will come times when we will lose cases. And with the exception of yours truly, the rest of the members said, well, no, that's never going to happen. And that attitude, combined with the attitude that psychologically prevails in the United States that Padideh just mentioned, I think have helped bring us to this turning point. The United States has always been ambivalent about international law. On the one hand, we have done arguably more than anyone else to help create it. But on the other hand, we repeatedly refuse to be bound by it and ignore it in our international actions, and increasingly including in trade. We want international law to bind everyone except us. Don't tread on me. And there is that psychological ambivalence, and the students have heard a bit of it in our discussions today, but it extends far beyond trade. And I think it goes to the identification by Americans of what we see as in our self-interest. Is it in our self-interest to take a broader and longer view that comprehends that the world will be a better and more prosperous and safer place if we have the international rule of law? Or is it in our self-interest to take the view that we as Americans should remain free to do whatever we think at the time we need to do, irrespective of international law? This is the underlying debate. Trade is a part of it. I think it's obvious which side of that debate I'm on and have been on for many years. And I believe Alan is on that side as well. And he and I may differ about a few appellate body rulings and their domestic political implications, and the pressures on both Democrats and Republicans alike to take anti-dumping and other trade remedy measures in order to be able to prevail in the swing states that seem to demand such measures politically. But I'm confident that he and I agree on this basic principle that we need to be bound by the international rule of law, including in trade. And both of us have worked all our lives to try to make that happen. There are going to be interests that will advocate particular trade measures that may not comply with the rules. And this is just part of the ongoing conduct of commerce. It's part of what the dispute settlement system is about, trying to resolve those disputes. But where the problem really becomes worse is in what we saw in the Trump administration, where there was a flagrant disregard for our trade obligations and many other aspects of international law, leaving us in the state, most notably in our US-China relations, that Daniel accurately described. In my view, for all of President Trump's unilateral trade actions against China, that in my view are illegal under WTO rules, and the phase one agreement, which I think, as Daniel accurately described, is in violation of the most favored nation principle. What have we really accomplished? We have done virtually nothing to get China to change the structural aspects of their economy that most aggrieve us. And I think the only answer is to go back to cooperative and coordinated action in the WTO to try to get new rules where we can, and to bring legal actions against China within the WTO that through the combined force of co-complainants will maximize the potential trade cost to China if it does not comply with adverse rulings. I hope that's what the Biden administration is trying to put together, but I'm concerned that they haven't done anything to unravel the vast illegality of the Trump trade regime. Thanks for indulging me on that.
Thank you, Jim. I wanted to talk about the US-China as well, but before that, I wanted to see if anybody wanted to talk about what they see is happening with the binding dispute settlement. Alan?
Yeah, I do think that solutions have to be worked on, although there are major issues that may prevent any quick resolution. The MPIA, the multi-party interim arrangement that the EU, China, and others have joined, expanded the membership of the appellate system to 10 from 7. It seems to me it's useful to think about what should be the membership going forward? How many members should there be? I agree with Jim that they should be lawyers. I also believe that there are specialties that can be brought in if you have an expanded membership on standards, on trips. One could look at what's the caseload look like, and do you have folks who have actual experience in that area who might be brought on board? You can also have more geographic representation with broader membership. Time limits, obviously, that's going to be imposed on reconstruction of any appellate mechanism. Domestic law being a factual state, matter of fact, and not reviewable is likely. The ability to have remands.
I agree with that, by the way.
Yeah, the ability to have remands. There was the Fukushima fish issue between Japan and Korea, where one side won totally at the panel level and the other side won totally at the appellate level. Why? Because the appellate body said, well, we don't think you completed your analysis, and oh, our system doesn't allow for a completion of analysis, so you're out of luck. That was before Abe's election. It was an embarrassment. There's a political tin air in the system of not understanding that these things actually affect the ability of countries to be supportive. And Abe called Trump and he said, what's going on here? I don't know that I like this dispute settlement system either. So, I mean, in the United States, the Supreme Court, as imperfect as it has been from time to time, including now, generally does not cross a line without knowing that it imperils its future. That happened in the 30s, and it's could happen now with something like voting rights. How many of those decisions can come down without the court membership in the United States getting expanded, which is talked about in some quarters. The real negotiation will be over instructions to the appellate body, which is, as Jim has said, the members have to decide some things. If they want safeguards or zeroing, anti-dumping to go in one direction or another, and they're going to give an instruction from either the dispute settlement body or the general counsel to the appellate body that reconstituted, it's a negotiation, and they'll figure out what they can only look backwards. It's sort of rear view mirror, but what do they want to do with it? Looking forward, what do they do with some subsidies involving public bodies, state-owned enterprises, that sort of thing. So I think it can be fixed. One shouldn't give up on that. And will there be a real negotiation on the subject? I think so. Probably beginning after MC 12, the ministerial conference at the end of the year, where I think the US will engage, and it'll be a tough negotiation, but we do need binding dispute settlement, and I don't exclude the US signing on, but it's going to be really a tough road to get there.
May I add one issue, and I'll try to be brief so that others can talk, but I agree with all that Alan's just said, especially on remand. In Canada Dairy years ago, we were stuck. We couldn't help the members have a chance to resolve the dispute because we had no remand power. That's happened time and again. On increasing the size of the appellate body, well, we've got 50% more membership in the WTO than we did when we created the appellate body. So you've got a tension between size and collegiality. I would argue for increasing the membership, and also for finding lawyers to do it who have varieties of expertise as well as different geographical identities. But the point I want to make is, yes, by all means, do these things. But I think the Achilles heel of the appellate body from the very beginning and the way it's structured has been the possibility of reappointment to a second term. The existence of this possibility depends on the mutual a restraint of WTO members in trying to somehow influence actions of the appellate body with the threat of not supporting them for a second term. Human beings being human beings, they're going to want to continue to get a second term, but there's always this tacit notion that they're subject to reappointment if they go astray. The United States of America has shamed itself by engaging in ex parte actions and all kinds of other actions in violation of the WTO rules of conduct and in violation of the dispute settlement understanding, and trying to influence the actions of appellate body members as a condition of U.S. support for their reappointment. This must never happen again. There's no evidence that it has succeeded in affecting any outcome of the WTO judgment by the appellate body, but it is simply wrong. And it is at the very basis a horrendous violation of the rule of law. One way to stop this from ever happening again or ever being the case for any member of the WTO is to simply end the possibility of reappointment. You have members of the appellate body appointed for one longer term. If you've got 7 members, maybe it's 7 years. If you got 9, maybe it's 9, and leave it at that. And this will maintain the independence and impartiality of the appellate body. It's crucial that they be unbiased as to all outside interests, but it's also crucial that they be independent and impartial with respect to all the members of the WTO, including their own country.
Thank you, Jim. I think, Daniel, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just had a quick point about the practical implications of not having an appellate body and a kind of credible rules-based dispute settlement system. That my practice for all of my years of practice has not focused on dispute settlement in the formal sense at the WTO. I do it every once in a while when I have to, but our practice goal is to resolve disputes in reference to the jurisprudence that exists and the texts and the laws. And when you have a client, either other government or a multinational comes and you put together a first white paper and you take that rule of law to that offending country, and that is what drives the dispute resolution outside of the system, having this corpus of law, and that country knows that if I bring that case, I've made the case that I'm going to win, and they're going to look bad and they'll have to implement. So we might as well find a solution outside of the litigation. So that's my practice. That's almost all I do. And for the last couple of years, that practice has become really hard, because if you know that there's not going to be an appeal, it's extremely difficult, or more difficult, to get that leverage that you need to resolve the problem outside of that kind of expensive and costly system. So in that context, I just like to say, as a kind of free trader and one who bases their career on free trade and under the existence of that rule of law, I really do think that it's hard for someone like me to find a space, because I'm nowhere near Trump and I'm not near Jim Bacchus. I'm somewhere in the middle saying, we have to recognize that there's. By the way,
Dan, it's Bacchus.
Yeah, that's okay.
But that's all right.
Got it. So my pronunciation's off. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Max and I have had problems for years with that.
Mary and Antonio, if there's anything you would like to add on this one. Yes. Mary? I think you're still muted.
So sorry. I have a foot in a cast, so I just feel so clumsy these days.
Oh, no.
Anyway, I wanted to say I'm fascinated by these discussions. I think, stepping back a little bit, it's clear that countries need a reason to constrain themselves, even the United States. And so again, we have to make sure that we provide those reasons for countries to, in a sense, voluntarily comply, because as I always say to my students, many of my more, I would say students who are more of a persuasion from the left, the WTO forces, I always say, who is the WTO's army? Is it a bunch of nerdy PhDs living in Geneva? So, I mean, we have to acknowledge that it's basically about voluntary compliance with the global system, and provide reasons for that. So enhance the benefits that flow from participation. I think there's lots of good ideas that have been put forth today, including expanding into new negotiating areas. The other is, of course, as Ambassador Wolff mentioned, providing flexibility within the system so that it is resilient. That's always been, I think, a feature of the WTO system. And lastly, Daniel pointed out the need for, in some sense, at the end, a hard place to say there is a place where the buck stops, and this will facilitate the mutual resolution of conflict. So I have found this discussion quite fascinating, and on those dimensions.
I'm going to turn to Antonio, but I want to ask this question of you all. And this is something that sort of occupies me. Of course, everybody else is this, the decoupling that some of you mentioned with China, and maybe the reality is that, I was on a panel recently for another conference about using sanctions and and raising tariffs, etc., and basically using trade to promote other interests like labor rights and gender. And it was the audience was more of a human rights audience. And one thing that is very clear is that this is not South Africa. This is not an apartheid sort of where sanction system may work. It's not the former Soviet Union or Russia. It's not Iran. We are so enmeshed with China that no matter how much the rhetoric, I mean, there's the political side, but our businesses are there. Trillions of dollars are going through Hong Kong, like they have not stopped since the democracy movement sort of backlash there. Goldman Sachs, I just read recently, is moving in. China is opening up, I guess, the financial sector for these players. And there's a danger that they may not be able to, do it forever. But it seems there's a complete disconnect between a conversation about containing China on the trade front and the reality on the ground, and the fact that we need their market and maybe they need ours. So there's a question, I'm just campaigning with a question with the audience, and I would like the audience we can take a few more minutes if you will indulge us and see if there are any additional questions about this. The question is, did China break the world economic order from Yamanullah Amanat? What will the world look like if China becomes the world leading economy, replacing the United States? So I want to just combine those arguments, because I remember being in Geneva and being told by an ambassador that the whole problem is US-China. If US-China can figure things out, then everything, the rest of us are going to sort of be able to expect that. And I wonder, the Belt and Road Initiative also is affecting all the developing countries. And there's been attempts now by the Biden administration and by the G7 to come up with an alternative to that. So maybe I'll start with you, Antonio. Maybe you want to talk about China's influence on the developing world and our enmeshment, and then I'll go through with everybody else. Antonio.
Thank you very much, Padideh. And obviously, this is a question that I think deserves a whole panel by itself. Fascinating what's happening in the world, and to really think, I would say, wisely about these issues. And let me start by, picking up on the point you made, which is, in fact, there is a lot of talk, whether because of COVID or about sort of reshoring, whether because of risks, nearshoring. In fact, we don't see companies doing that. We don't really see, certainly not as yet, GVCs being undone. We don't even see this sense of a trade-off between efficiency and resilience. in the sense of the risks that have been put on the table, have been evidenced in the last few years, whether by the changes in trade policy at the global level, or whether more recently by the pandemic, and these days also by the the shocks to the container shipping industry. So despite of that, we see GVCs to be extremely resilient. We see the companies are not driving for, let me call it, decoupling. Now, what does this really tell us? Well, it tells us, first and foremost, that the system is there because it is efficient. It is efficient at producing welfare, at producing benefit for the whole world. And I would add that there hasn't really been a change in fundamentals, meaning at the moment, prices are essentially the same that they were before. Yes, we see a little bit of turmoil due to the pandemic, but in fact, we saw trade and GVCs bouncing back, let me say, with a vengeance. Trade increased between March and April by 20%, and it's already way above the levels it was before the pandemic. Now, there are some problems related to the unevenness of trade. I don't want to get into that. What I'm saying is, if we left it to the market, clearly, you're not going to see much of a change, even in the phase of the risks that have been highlighted by the pandemics. You're not going to see much of a change in the fundamental structure of production and interdependencies. Some may be regionalization. FDI has been sort of frozen for the past year, so it is possible the companies are also waiting and see. But what we hear by talking to companies is they're much more worried, by the way, about climate change, about the long-term implications of changes in comparative advantages as to where they put their plants, then they're worried about the increased risk that they see from pandemics and the like. Now, this to say that it wouldn't go. The other side is, are we not going to see any changes? No, you also mentioned it. There is a possibility that governments will, for different reasons, introduce policies that will change the fundamentals. They will penalize companies that do not reshore, or they will make it expensive, to produce abroad, etc. So we might still see a lot of this. However, the point is, if those measures are introduced, they come at a cost. We know from a whole decades of economic literature that the fastest way to growth, to welfare, is through trade. And we know of a lot of countries, and I would say regions of the world, that have lost decades for listening to the sirens of mercantilism and self-sufficiency. So I think this is a fascinating discussion, because obviously there are some, and right now both in the US, in Europe, in many advanced countries, there is a lot of debate, a lot of move at what are strategic value chains, how far can we be, do we want to ration? That's clearly a as you say, more of a national security issue. It's not really an economic consideration, which is my point. And those national security issues come at a price. And so it'd be interesting to try and identify what are the prices they were talking about. Let me leave it at that, because I think my colleagues are much better placed to take over from here. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn to Alan. Is there anything you would like to say about the China?
I think there will be areas for possible agreement on climate change, on trade and health, how to deal with pandemics, the areas of interdependence that could be sectoral agreements in chemicals and semiconductors, maybe environmental goods agreement, ITA expansion, ITA 3. There may be real commonality of interest that are not across the board, but they're selective opportunities to move forward with China. I would say, I wouldn't blame you're quoting an ambassador in Geneva saying, all would be good if the US and China resolved all of their problems. I would say the Doha development agenda went into the garbage can well before the US-China situation evolved to where it is today. I have great faith in the members of the WTO being able to find paralysis in other areas without relying on the US and China fighting each other. Last small thing on the appellate body, If I were Director General, I would say, I'm not supporting any advisory opinions being given. Either you agree the panel is final, or you come up with an alternative mechanism like MPIA, or you agree to reconstitute an appellate body, but you don't come here for an advisory opinion. And let the United States think about that sort of world where there is no WTO role for dispute settlement. You don't get a panel to give you an advice. If you decide you don't like it, then you appeal into the void. Not acceptable. You say up front whether you're going to abide by the panel or have some other mechanism for an appeal. There are ways of forcing action and that make the United States maybe rethink where it is today on that subject. Anyway, I've enjoyed our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Daniel, would you like to, about the China, the question, if there's anything you would like to talk about?
Just one observation, even before the heavy-handedness in Hong Kong and the Xinjiang situation now, in 2019, I'm just looking at statistics now from UNCTAD, FDI fell 34% to Hong Kong in 1 year. And that was when everybody was getting nervous about how they're being treated. So it's not just all roses there, and China's, opening up its financial system to get the likes of, Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan to start investing more, and they will unless their home governments prevent them from doing so. The only other thing that I would add on the supply chain side, especially with China, is that both the United States and the EU are currently conducting reviews, like administrative interagency processes, gathering comments from all stakeholders to come up with a supply chain security and redundancy initiative. It doesn't mean that we're going to cut off China. It just means that the fact that supply chains haven't been changed until now doesn't mean that it's not going to come. I believe it will come, and there will be some effect, but everybody's going to have to trade with China, and it's not going to be totally cut off. I think there will be different rules, as there always, as Alan pointed out, when we had issues with our Asian trading partners who became too successful too fast, we didn't go back to the rules-based system initially. We just worked outside of the rules on non-MFN gray area measures, restrictions, just agreed to solve the problem. And unfortunately, I just think that's going to be the path pragmatically that the United States and many other countries will take with China, and we'll find a way forward. And then eventually everybody will realize that's never a good way to deal with things, and we'll come back to multilateralism, but only when we can make rules when the disputes system goes off the rails, or when important members think they're not happy. Like in any rule of law system, criticism from the members, the parliament or the populace, doesn't mean you don't have rule of law. It means you're not happy with a solution, and the solution has to be writing new laws and amending laws and clarifying laws and making them better, not burning the house down. And so I think there shouldn't be a suggestion that just because we need to change the way the WTO operates in both its negotiating and dispute settlement functions, it doesn't mean you want to tear down the system. I think that was the goal of the Trump administration through all of this, but that was not successful, and I think we'll rebuild and build back better.
Thank you, Daniel. Jim, and then I'll end with Barry for the remark. Jim.
Yes, well, first of all, Daniel has described, I think, an accurate scenario, which would be a repeat of what happened in the 1970s and 80s, when Alan and I and a lot of others came to the conclusion that, well, we need rules that can be enforced. And that's why we created the WTO and the dispute settlement system in the first place. And I would emphasize, in a quarter century since, generally rules have been enforced. And as Dan mentioned earlier, a lot of the enforcement is self-enforcement. never sees the light of day in terms of jurisprudence. The success of the WTO is much in what doesn't happen, because there is general compliance with the rules of trade. The second and last point I want to make is really for the students here. Alan kindly mentioned that I've written a lot about the need to inject morality into what we do in trade and all the dimensions that have been suggested. And I think it's important to do that in what governments do, but I wanted to turn in conclusion to something we haven't discussed, which is what the private sector does. Because most of these students are going to end up practicing law or working for companies out in the private sector. And I spent most of my life in the private sector, most recently chairing the global practice of the largest law firm in the United States and one of the largest in the world, Greenberg Traurig. And in the private practice of law, as Daniel and Alan, of course, also know, you're confronted every day with decisions. Are we going to take this client? Do we want to advocate this position? And more broadly in the private sector with companies, they're confronted every day with you know, a particular question, which is how far are we willing to bend what we believe are basic principles of morality in order to make money? That's the reality of global capitalism. And with respect to a lot of companies in their relationships with China, they're facing this question, but they also face it in the United States as well, in their own domestic decision making. And as we've seen lately, a lot of companies are trying to do things a bit differently. But in terms of China, American businesses and other foreign businesses, European, Canadian, others, are going to be faced with just how far are we willing to appease the Chinese government in order to attain or maintain access to their market. And my thinking is that the Chinese are overplaying their hand here. There are everyday examples of how American businesses embarrass themselves in trying to appease the Chinese. But I think the overall trend is in the other direction. And I don't think the Chinese actually have as much economic clout as they seem to think they have, facing some of the very real environmental, demographic, labor costs, debt, and other challenges that they face domestically. So I'm hopeful that, you know, separate and apart from whatever governments do, we'll see individual people in the private sector simply refusing not to stand up against Chinese abuses of human rights or abuses of human rights elsewhere. Lastly, going back to dispute settlement in the end, please note what the Australian Prime Minister told at the G20 just a couple of weeks ago. He said, we need a binding dispute settlement system. What's happened? China, Australia and Australian businesses have had the courage to stand up and criticize the Chinese for not being fully transparent and forthcoming about the origins of COVID-19. And in response, the Chinese have imposed certain trade measures, trade restrictions. Now, Australia is challenging those as violations of WTO rules. But under the current system, as Alan said, and as Dan has discussed, they can't get a resolution. They can't get a ruling that could be enforced against China. And that's where we currently stand. And that's not where we need to be.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for hearing me out today.
Thank you. Thank you. Mary. given all your experience with China, tell us what your thoughts are on, is it really people are going to back, we are not at the mercy of Chinese market?
Chinese market is formidable. Jeff Schott and I have a new policy brief out on the new blocking rules that China has issued in blocking law, accepted just this month, trying to counter US sanctions. So I will end with something that I think is a little bit sort of larger to frame it, which is that, you know, those of us who came up, I came up in the 80s and 90s, and we wanted trade to include things like labor standards and the environment, saw them as a way that trade would be more relevant and responsive to people. Unfortunately, I think that we also face the opposite challenge, which is that trade is used and blamed for everything. We see it here in the United States, I think, with the so-called China shock that has been, you know, quoted as the source of the ills in the American labor market. I think they go far beyond that. We see it in issues like failing to achieve consensus on how to deal with climate change. So Ambassador Wolff said he was confident that the members could come to a stalemate without China. I think that we are able to not solve our problems without China as well. So I think in the trade community, we have to say, yes, these things need to be modernized. They have to be brought into trade, but so much more needs to be done in civil society to address the morality questions that Jim mentioned, so important. My own view on talking with US corporations is that they're often in difficult situations, but actually can be standard bearers for pollution control, for treatment of workers, et cetera. Gender equity in the Chinese market. So again, it has to be at civil society, among our corporations, among our workers, among our politicians, our diplomats. So again, I think that there are some real issues that we want to bring into trade and need to modernize the institutions to deal with. But we also have to say that these problems go well beyond trade. Trade can't be the scapegoat for all these problems. When I listen to the Biden administration, as much as I love a lot of what they're doing, when I hear, you know, trade policy for the middle class, I have to ask myself, what does that mean? Middle class, for one thing, needs reliable and consistent health insurance, and, you know, not resolving the dispute settlement is not going to get them there. So I would say, yes, let's be ambitious. Thank you to my fellow panelists for being optimistic, but also let's be humble in what trade can do to solve these big problems. And thanks again for allowing me to be on the panel.
I want to thank you, Ambassador Wolff, Jim Bacchus, Mary Lovely, Antonio Nucifera, Daniel Crosby. It's been such a pleasure to have this conversation with you. Renata?
I just would like to make one comment, because you talked so much about the AppellateBody and the fact that we need to raise the younger generation as believers, maybe. And that reminded me of our interview with Peter van den Bosch for this program, that at some point we were discussing that maybe we are all part of a sinking boat, but we do need believers and we do need to raise believers. So I think this is an excellent, extraordinary panel to end our program of 2 weeks, inspiring people, younger people that are coming to maybe run the world and the world economic order for the following year. So thank you so much for that, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you again for joining us. And this will be available on YouTube. If you would like to send it the link, we can provide you with. Also, Alan's comments. I believe it's going to be on the Peterson Institute's website, Alan. Is that right? And we will also provide it to all the participants. Thank you again. And thank you for your time. I would like to tell all our participants that it's been our pleasure. Please don't forget to fill out the survey and let us know how we did. And we look forward to perhaps seeing you next week for those that want to join us, and maybe next year for the next installment of this course. Thank you very much again. Bye-bye.